about interpretation in Spanish, so I'm just going to do a quick tidbit in Spanish. Este evento cuenta con el servicio de interpretación simultánea al idioma español. Para acceder a este servicio en Windows o Mac, por favor seleccione el icono que dice Interpretación que se encuentra en la parte inferior derecha de su panel de control. Luego seleccione Spanish en el menú de opciones. Asimismo tendrá la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. En Android o Apple, si está en su teléfono, por favor seleccione el icono de los puntos suspensivos, que son 3 puntos, que se encuentran en los controles de la reunión. Luego seleccione Spanish en el menú de opciones. Asimismo, tendrá la opción de silenciar el audio original aquí. Seleccione Done. Muchísimas gracias y espero que puedan entender eso y accesar el evento en español. So now I would really love to introduce Jimmy Recinos. He is my co-collaborator on this series that we've been organizing for months now. He is the editor-in-chief of JimboTimes.com and the host of JT the Storyteller podcast. And he's going to go over redlining and some information about the neighborhood from his own personal perspective as a lifelong resident. So Jimmy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sammy, and congratulations to us. We made it. We have come a long way just for a few hours with our audience tonight, but we know that it's worth it. So let me take you all to our presentation and get this started for you all. Let's go. Okay, and you can see that, right, Sammy?
Yep, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so my name is Jimmy Recinos. I also am known as J.T. or JT for short, Jimbo Times, the LA Storyteller. That's a little bit about myself there. That's what we've looked like planning for this event all these days. And this is the sort of full title, if you will. I wanted to sneak in a little bit of the full title there. So I have been writing at JimboTimes.com since 2014, and just earlier this January, I passed a 250,000 threshold, if you will. So 250,000 words, 250,000 words published about the city of LA with a lot of love for the city of LA. And so please go and check that out whenever you get the chance. JimboTimes.com is the place to be. And so I'm going to take you all through a little bit of my experience through the neighborhood known as East Hollywood, which is a place that I've grown up in alongside other peers of mine, some of whom are still in the neighborhood, many of whom are not. And I sort of would be remiss not to shout out Mom's Newsstand on Santa Monica Boulevard, which this year will complete 20 years on Santa Monica Boulevard. This is where I picked up a lot of literature, where I spent a lot of time learning about culture, analyzing people walking by, and so on. And so I have to shout Mom's Newsstand out, which will be 20 years old on Santa Monica Boulevard just this year. So cheers, we made it. Here are some neighbors. Here's the neighborhood. That's got to be one of my favorite pictures of all time. That's Michelle and her son Benny. Graffiti. That mural is no longer there. You may recognize some of these places, you may not if you're familiar with East Hollywood. That's an old friend of mine, childhood friend of mine, LACC in the background. This is a building just before it was redeveloped, before rents really skyrocketed at the spot. This is something you see on Virgil Avenue a lot, folks picking up cans, transferring cans, getting money for cans. And then this is also something you see a lot in the neighborhood, chicharrones, a lot of smiles, a lot of humility, a lot of culture, a lot of integrity. The 4 on Vermont, Santa Monica Boulevard, the Red Line. No pun intended, the Red Line at Vermont and Santa Monica Station. That was the jam. The 101 freeway, you can't talk about East Hollywood without noting the 101 freeway. That's just a fact of life for all of us. And then, of course, John's, this man is, this essential worker is bringing food and produce for the people of East Hollywood. our Filipino families, and the bread. Bread is culture everywhere. And so is that struggle, so is integrity. Another fact we can't get around about East Hollywood is that it's very policed, actually. There's a lot of policing of the predominantly immigrant renting community that resides here. That's just something that we've seen for a long time. Certainly I've been witness to that, and certainly my peers have been witness to this over the course of many, many years. This is the 7-Eleven last summer in the wake of the tensions. And so this is just a little of the neighborhood that I've really got in mind as I go through this event, as I go through this presentation with you all. East Hollywood is a place where we've lost a lot of people, so it's a real privilege to speak with you tonight. And let's get into it. Let's talk redlining for a moment. An official government policy marking areas where Black and immigrant people resided as undesirable for investment. In LA, redlining areas where Black and immigrant communities resided included neighborhoods like downtown LA, South Central, virtually all of East Los Angeles, and some of today's most up-and-coming neighborhoods, including East Hollywood, Silver Lake, Echo Park, and more. This is the precise area that we've got in mind here, an area that includes Virgil Village, the neighborhood formerly known as J Flats, which we'll be hearing from a lot, and which we will, and we've also got the Sunset Junction area, actually, where a lot of you all have seen signs. This is an area description of that redline sign, or this redlined area, if you will. The population is highly heterogeneous, with more than a sprinkling of subversive racial elements, there being several concentrations of Japanese and Negroes within the district. There's also quite a Jewish population, adjacent to the synagogue, which is located in the northern part. While by no means a slum district, the area is definitely blighted and is accorded a medial red grade. Now, the real big deal about redlining is that it took place just a couple of years after something known as the Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual was sent everywhere to people who built housing. And I'm not going to go through all this. There are 2 slides for it, but this was, again, 1936, correct? So this is the federal government advising housing developers, people who built housing, what they needed to look out for if they wanted a loan, if they wanted to be approved for a loan to build that housing. The valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be racially homogeneous. White people should live where white people live. Black people should live where Black people live. Immigrants, the same. And so through the research process, we actually came across a tract and the written text of a tract in the Los Feliz area. And so you can see a number of different provisions here. And in paragraph 11, it states, said property or any part thereof shall not, nor shall any interest therein at any time be rented, leased, sold, devised, or conveyed to, or inherited by, or be otherwise acquired by, or become the property of, or be occupied by any person whose blood is not of the Caucasian race. So very clear, very explicit that only whites were allowed to live in Los Feliz over the course of the 1930s and 1940s. Now, this is what's really interesting, actually. This is actually taken from an area description of the same area that we were looking at earlier, the Sunset Junction and Virgil Village, and also J Flats area. We had about 15% of the population around there consisting of immigrant families, mostly Japanese American families, but also Mexican American families, possibly more. We don't know entirely. We also had a small population of African Americans. And so this is the big idea. Even if we have a small population of non-white people, the area is redlined because remember the underwriting manual, the classes should all be the same. The races should all be the same. I also want viewers of tonight's presentation to keep this in mind. In the 1930s, the population, the non-white population, was really small. So if we think about 1930 in particular, the US Census says about 35,000 Japanese Americans, very few Indian or Native Americans, Similarly for Chinese, while we had a couple thousand African-American people. The white population in Los Angeles, on the other hand, was just under 2 million. And the same would pretty much be true. The same disparities, very small non-white populations. And yet when they entered an area that was predominantly white, that was an area that was redlined. So I also want to keep in mind over the course of tonight's presentation that housing in the early 1940s was a big issue. Some of you all may be familiar with the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, so to speak. After those riots, one Negro leader from South Central Los Angeles at the time was asked to speak about how tensions could be relieved. That leader said, in his words, that he told the jury about increased housing problems facing the Negro districts as a result of the recent influx of more than 30,000 Negroes who've come to Los Angeles to take good paying defense jobs. So this is in the 1940s that we were learning that, hey, housing is an issue. What's also true is that in the 1940s, when public housing was becoming increasingly available, cities rejected it, including the city of LA. So it's a little blurry here. We won't go through the whole text, but I've got most of these images right on jimbotimes.com. Please see them. And with that, we've got just a background for redlining and the way that housing is a serious issue, certainly one we're dealing with today and one that communities have dealt with historically. Samanta, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Jimmy, for that. And, just to reiterate, redlining was this form of systemic racism, right? We talk a lot about systemic racism, and this is one early example of that, right? So these areas were considered undesirable for investment because there were immigrants and Black people living in them. And what that meant is that people couldn't access loans for their houses. So people couldn't buy houses. There was a general disinvestment in these neighborhoods. Meanwhile, predominantly white areas that had restrictions on who could live there built up wealth, right? And we know that one of the main ways to build wealth in the United States is through owning property, because you can pass it on down, it builds wealth, you can sell it, you can invest, it's an investment. So if you're not able to do that, it becomes really difficult to build wealth. And so systemically, people of color were excluded from building wealth. And now when you look at neighborhoods that were formerly redlined, they are the same neighborhoods that have been disinvested in, that are considered ghetto or are considered poor, right? But this was done not because people weren't working hard. It was because they were systemically disadvantaged and unable to build wealth. And those very same areas are often going through gentrification today. So I just want to make that note, how this redlining happened in the 30s, but we still see the legacies of those policies today. And then, along with, redlining was this exclusionary racist practice. And what this did in LA specifically is it really segregated the neighborhoods, right? So in Los Feliz was a white neighborhood, like almost exclusively, right? But just to the south in East Hollywood, because there were very few deed restrictions, or if there were, they weren't really enforced, it meant that people of color could live there. It was a safe place for them to live, right? They could start a business there, they could rent an apartment there, and even if they were able to, buy a house there. So these little enclaves formed around Los Angeles. That's why we talk about Boyle Heights, right? Boyle Heights had Jewish, Italian, Mexican, Japanese people living there. And the same thing goes for East Hollywood. It became a multi-ethnic enclave because people literally couldn't live anywhere else. And, this meant that while, yes, tensions might have existed as people were competing for resources in a predominant white city that was excluding and oppressing people, it also meant there was a lot of solidarity. And this story that we're about to tell you next is about that solidarity. And it takes place in a little pocket of East Hollywood called Dayton Heights. So Dayton Heights is just south of Virgil Village. It starts at Virgil and Melrose. And it's this little pocket that became a Japanese and Japanese American enclave. So a lot of workers live there. A lot of immigrants move there to start businesses, to work as gardeners for neighboring Los Feliz, for neighboring Hollywood. and it became a vibrant neighborhood. But there was also this Black history, particularly the history of one Black family that came there in the 1800s and saw their neighborhood evolve and forged friendships with their multi-ethnic neighbors. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two panelists, which this is a really, really special thing. We're really honored to have them here. I first want to introduce Karen Burch. Karen Burch is a fourth generation Dayton Heights native. Her family came here in 1892. She was a former school psychologist and a multimedia producer and writer. And Karen is currently writing a book about her family story. Then we also have Mr. Takashi Hoshizaki. Takashi is also a lifelong Dayton Heights resident. His parents came from Japan, and Takashi is one of 300 draft resistors during Japanese American internment. He is a former botanist who worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab for many, many years. So I'd like to welcome our two panelists. If they can unmute themselves and open up their video so we can see them, that would be amazing.
There we go.
Awesome. Hi, Karen.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Takashi, if you could please open up your video, please.
Okay, let's see. Start video.
There we go.
All right.
Hello,
Old
both
man
of you.
can't handle this stuff.
Thank you for joining us today. Karen, I'd like to first start out by asking you to take us a little bit through your family story. How is it that your great-grandparents ended up in East Hollywood, and how did your grandmother describe the area, you know, in your great-grandparents' time?
Right. Well, first, let me thank you for doing this. It's a wonderful, well, it's a wonderful story, but it's in a context of, you know, I keep thinking about what Jimmy went through with the redlining. But let me take you back. My great-grandfather was George Washington Albright. He was born in 1846 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I say he was born into slavery as opposed to he was a slave because he was a brilliant man. And this came out more and more as he grew. My great-grandmother is Josephine Hardy Albright. And Josephine was a school teacher from Massachusetts who came down to Mississippi during the Reconstruction period, which was just after the Civil War, to work with the freed slaves. And both Josephine and George were very interested in education. They were interested in all things that were going to help America embrace the promise, finally, of all men and women are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This Reconstruction was a chance for all of America to embrace this creed. But as we know, that particular period of time, it didn't happen. My great-grandfather, George, was a state senator in Mississippi. And as Black people began to vote in large numbers, they were able to elect Black people to the state Senate and the state Congress. But the, you know, it would be wonderful to think that racism disappeared in the South, and we know it did not. In fact, it grew to the point where several incidents happened. I won't go into them right now, but one was the Clinton massacre of 1875. More and more Blacks were being outright killed and lynched. So George and Josephine, who fell in love at some point while they were there together, decided it was time to leave. And they went first to Chicago, Illinois, where their first child was born. And then they went to Emporia, Kansas for about 10 years. There they started their family. They started a farm, and George continued in politics. It's a very long story and a very complex one, and I'm going to try to keep it short. They decided to come to Los Angeles because, in my mind, I think there's a certain kind of person that would come to really almost the edge of the world, Los Angeles. You know, a lot of people back east probably had heard of San Francisco. They knew of the gold rush, but LA was a little sleepy kind of backwater town. And my great-grandfather arrived first and was looking at the land, looking for a place to bring his family. And I can see him riding in my mind. I can see this. I can see him riding on horseback, headed west, where he gets to the other side of Hoover and sits on a hill and looks down at this side of Hoover. My grandmother wrote this. I'm just going to read this kind of quickly, if you don't mind. Dayton Heights is closely connected with the early history of LA. Students of early California history will recall the famous Battle of Fort Hill, where the American army was almost surrounded by the soldiers of Mexico. As a last desperate resort, a rider was sent out to try and bring help from General Fremont, then somewhere beyond the mountains. Undoubtedly, this rider came through Dayton Heights on his wild ride into the Cahuenga Pass. The rider accomplished his mission, and California was saved for the United States. She goes on to say the first settlers in this little community were Mexican families. In the 1880s, Americans from back east started moving into small ranches. Orchards of fruit trees were planted, a small irrigation system started, and the lowland was flooded and planted in cord, while on the hillsides grew fields of wheat and barley. In spring and summer, wildflowers grew in profusion. Rabbits and quails were plentiful, and along the streams there was good fishing. Marshy ponds surrounded tules and tall cattails were the landing places of wild duck and geese as they migrated north and south. It was a beautiful sight to see the formation of stately geese as they came in for a landing. So that's what our little neighborhood looked like when the Albright family arrived. Here are some pictures. This is, in fact, the whole family. George Washington in the middle, Josephine Hardy to his right. My grandmother is, as we look at the pictures, she is on the far right in the back. Then they had 3 children. So my grandmother, Crystal, her brother, Roy, who's standing next to her, and on the far side, their little brother, Wendell, Roy's wife, and these are the start of the children. So I'll stop because I know we're pushing time. This is a picture of my grandmother, actually. This is, a lot of you out there will know Crystal as Nana. This is Nana, probably in her very early 20s. She homesteaded in Lancaster. So she would spend 6 months out of the year proving up the land, is how she would say it, which is improving the land. Developing crops, building a house, raising farm animals. And here she is in the with the horses and the buggies doing her work.
Thank you, Karen. So your great-grandparents and your grandmother really saw their neighborhood change, right?
Oh, yes, most definitely. It went from, as I was saying, from the marshy farmland when they settled. They talk about, well, Nana talked about up on Vermont, in between, where am I, Clinton and Beverly, there was a big pond where they would frequently go and wash clothes. And so as you come down the hill, come down Clinton Street or come down Middlebury, that lowland is where they developed their farm, and built the first house, which is where I grew up at 537 Northwest Moreland. That's the original house. George and Josephine, obviously on in years, but that was the original house.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Sure.
And Takashi, I'd love to ask you if you could share a little bit about your family story and how it is that your family ended up in the Dayton Heights area, which went on to become called J Flats. I think you're muted. Nina, if you could unmute Takashi, please.
All right. Okay. I think we're set to go here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, fine. Well, actually, my dad came into the United States about the 1910 or so and went to work for my uncle. There's a long history there, but the other thing was around 1924, they had they were going to pass a law restricting now the Japanese being able to immigrate into the United States. So at that time, my dad went back to Japan, married my mother, and they came back just about a month before the Exclusion Act went into effect. And so then I say that the 1924, and that's one of the reasons I was born in 1925. But my dad worked for my uncle for a while, and then I guess around in 1932 or 1930s, early 30s, he decided to strike out on his own, and I don't know how or where he discovered or found a possibility of running a grocery store. And this was now already a sort of an enclave of the Japanese. So my uncle was importing Japanese food. And so then my dad then started this Fujiya cash and grocery store on Virgil and Clinton Street, which is now called OSI, O-S-I. And that is where we got to start. We lived at that time just behind, next to the store. And, but then by 1937, my dad did well enough so that he bought the vacant lot, which then was very next to the Marshalls, which you can see is on the left side of the picture. The Marshall's house is directly in front. And I'm looking at, I believe that's probably Kyoko, my youngest sister. And so my dad then ran the grocery store, did very well. Then we had the infamous 1942 executive order, which then we had to then leave. And it was the marshals that really helped us out, taking care, and then took us when we had to go to a pickup point up there in Lexington and where was that? Westmoreland. There was a church there, and so that's was sort of the start of the neighborhood. And by then, 1942, the area was fairly well developed, but there were quite a number of what I call vacant lots. We as kids call empty lots there. So I'll stop right there. Yeah.
Thank you, Takashi. And I believe there's I think there's an alarm that's going off in the background of your, I don't know if it's in your house, but there seems to be an alarm going off.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's okay. Then I'm gonna have to take care of that.
Yeah,
All
of
right?
course. I'll ask Karen a question. Okay, so Karen, Takashi talked a little bit about how he got to the neighborhood, and by then it was already, a Japanese and Japanese American enclave. A big part of your family's story and of all the generations, in your family is this friendship that developed with their Japanese neighbors. Can you talk about that and how that started, and give me some examples of that neighborly interaction that happened between both families? And just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry about that. It was something that happened quite naturally. In fact, as you're looking at these pictures, the little house this little house was my grandparents, Nana and Granddaddy, Crystal and Rufus Marshall. When the Albrights settled in the area, slowly different, Nana described it as a United Nations. There were French, there were German, and slowly, I think more in the 20s is when the Japanese started moving in. And she remembers her mother, Josephine, sitting on the porch with other, in Japanese, we would say obasan, other grandmothers, getting, the dinner together, and they couldn't speak, Josephine couldn't speak Japanese, and the Japanese grandmothers weren't speaking English yet, but they spoke what I call the language of friendship, watching out for the kids. Now, my grandmother and grandfather worked very hard. They had their own catering business, but in each generation, there were best friends, starting with Josephine, and then Crystal and Rufus, and then their children, who were Takashi's age. And in fact, my uncle, this is a picture of my aunt, Barbara Williams, and Takashi's younger sister. We were all just friends. And, I was comparing notes with my sister, Cheryl McDonald, earlier, and I'm just going to read you these names because these are friends of ours throughout the 4 generations. There were the Kakibas, the Shimizus, the Nakasones, the Emis, Endos, Uemuras, Tanis, the Kunitomis, the Matsuokas, the Hoshizakis, obviously, the Ozawas, Nagatani, Nagai, Kimura, Shiraishi, Shimazu, Fumi Iwasaki, who was, when I was a little girl, she was a very revered elder of the church, Kodani Nakahara, and this is actually a picture of Laura Matsuoka, who is sitting in the middle, my late brother Clinton Burch, who is sitting on the far right, and then me, the little punk on the end. But we're sitting in front of, or across the street from the old Dayton Heights. We were all just friends, and there was no, we didn't think of race. I shudder to think the adventures that Takashi and my uncle Rufus got into together, but they were friends. And as Takashi was saying, there were not so much when we were little, when I was little, but there were vacant lots where kids could go and play, and we would frequently disappear, especially during summer, disappear for the day and come back. But it was always with, you just hung out with your friends. Does that, I hope that answers or starts to answer your question.
Yes, of course. And how did you connect to the Japanese culture? I know you've shared some things with me in the past about connecting to it.
Oh, yeah. My friend Christine Shimizu, she's actually, there's a picture of us, our 6th grade graduation picture, and she's standing next to me. This is the one. We're in the last row at the top, starting from my left is Jenny Nagatani, Christine Shimizu, and that's me. And Chris and I have been friends since kindergarten, and I say have been because we still are. We got our vaccinations together, but as little people after school, I would frequently go over her house to play, and I looked forward to it because either her mom would have bologna sandwiches for us, or she would have sushi, and maki sushi or inari sushi. It was, I always looked forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen.
And sure.
Takashi, I just wanted to ask you, you got to the Dayton Heights area in the 30s. What was it like growing up there in the 30s before the war? And if you could just unmute yourself. Oh, I think you're muted.
All right, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. Well, as I said, it was a neighborhood that we grew up. I grew up there, and as Karen indicated, that's my sister Yoko there. Well, Rufus and I, actually, yeah, we played together, and in fact, when we got graduated out of grammar school, then we're going down to, at that time it's called Virgil Junior High School. Rufus says, well, he says, he says, I'm going to join the boys glee club. And I said, oh, yeah. He said, we get to get out of classes to go sing places. And I said, oh, well, okay. So Rufus and I joined the glee club, and that was things, we did things like that together. But at that time, I must say that aviation was a kind of a prime interest. And so I ended up building model airplanes, and we had one area that's completely empty. And so I would then test fly my models there. And so that I remember that being an open area. Today, we just don't see that kind of a place close in. You have to go miles. In fact, we have to go all the way over to Sepulveda Basin to do same thing that I was able to do right across the street. But the other thing was that the Japanese parents actually built a Japanese language school, which is still there on, it's on Juanita and Middlebury, but it's now called the Hollywood Japanese Cultural Institute, and they have various activities. But so that was one of the things that I ended up going to that Japanese language school. And all I can say is that I didn't have much free time because coming home from, say, the Virgil Junior High School, we then had to go every weekday to the Japanese language school. Then my dad was running a business, and so that meant that both Friday, Saturdays and Sundays, I would be there at the grocery store helping out. And so I guess I kept myself pretty busy all along in that particular period of time.
Yeah, thank you, Takashi. And I wanted to ask, following the declaration of the war with Japan, when did you realize that things were about to change, that your family could be sent away? When did you kind of start to realize that?
Well, I guess the first group that really was affected and they had to move out were the people, the fishing group down in Terminal Island. And so they were given, I forgot, something like a couple of days or maybe 3 days to move out. And then suddenly the military changed their mind and they had to get out in 24 hours. But so the word went out among the Japanese community, and in our neighborhood, there were families that had relatives at Terminal Island. So one of the first things that happened was we had new people into our neighborhood. And so then I realized, oh, they are now moving people out of the various areas. And we learned that they're now going to move people out in different blocks or different districts. And the first thing was that they had set up a I guess they call a reception center, which is now today at the Manzanar up in up north, close to Bishop, California. And so that was the first camp. And so that was the thing that says, well, we're going to probably be moving out. And then we heard that in certain areas, signs were being posted on telephone poles, actually defining the areas which had to be moved out in a particular day. You can see there April 1st, and then order number 5. And then they were given on that instructions that they were to meet the people who were affected by this order, had to meet at a particular place. In case, as time went on, our district, our area was then also included. And so we ended up at church at Lexington, I think Lexington and Westmoreland. And this is where the marshals really helped the people out. And so I still think about that. And they were sort of the, I guess, the place that one could say that really set the area so that we had something that's stable that we could really consider. And so, Kiwi, I want to thank you and your family for all the help that they did at that time.
Karen, your Aunt Barbara has described that day when all of a sudden her friends, her neighbors were forced to leave. and she talks about the way your grandparents helped out their neighbors. Can you describe that day and what you've heard about it?
Yes, yeah. I can't tell it the way my aunt can, because she was first person. She was there, but she said my grandmother woke up very early, as did my grandfather. But Nana started cooking, and she made biscuits and hot coffee and scrambled eggs. And every family that had, what little belongings they could carry, she had them come in, sit down, have breakfast, have a good meal. And I guess I would assume have a good cry too, because at that point, my Aunt Babs is the middle child. No, I'm sorry. Aunt Babs is the youngest of, my mother was the oldest, Josephine also. And then Rufus was in the middle, but they all had friends that were leaving, and it was heartbreaking. I wasn't there, but I see it through their eyes. There were families that asked if my grandparents could keep for them, whether it was something small or, material things, or something like power of attorney over their property. I know that there was and Takashi, maybe you can remind me, there's a nursery that was on Virgil in between Clinton and Melrose. And Nana's nephews, Carl and Arthur, took over the nursery for the Japanese family that owned it, so that they would have something to come back to. And we just found out today, Samantha, this was kind of incredible. Just today, a friend of my sister Cheryl's, let me find my notes, Karen Hirose. Karen was born after the war, but she said there was a family, a Black family on Virgil. And she thinks they were called the Stewarts, who also did the same thing for the Hirose family. And I don't know if they had power of attorney, but she said that because of this Stewart family, that her family was able to come back to the neighborhood. This would have been south of the 101 freeway on Westmoreland. And, I don't mind saying I'm 68 years old, and I'm just hearing this today. So you think about all of the stories, not just my family, but all of the stories that don't get told because of the same racial practices that have been going on since the beginning of this country, unfortunately. But they're being told now. So God bless the Stewarts and the Marshalls,
Thank you, Karen.
Sure.
And Takashi, I wanted to ask you, once your family was taken to the Pomona Assembly Center where you remained for, I think, over 3 months, you might have told me, you received a visit from Nana, Karen's grandmother. Can you describe that visit?
Yeah, well, I was working then in the mess hall helping out, and I got word that says you have visitors. So I said, oh, okay, well, and then they directed me to where we were able to meet the visitors. I remember it was a big, long, I guess, a fence, wired fence but had openings were large enough that you could pass things through. And so find out that Nana was there. And to me, I really remember because it was really joyful, but at the same time, I was a little embarrassed because here in that, and Pomona gets awfully hot. And so there we were in that hot area, and Nana had brought out an apple pie that she had cooked. And the way that if you really know how to cook, you can then set it up so that the upper crust of the pie would been standing up with the big room inside. Well, she brought that apple pie, and I remember that crust was still standing up high, and she put in vanilla ice cream, and I sat and I had this ice cream, this pie a la mode in my hand. I was a little embarrassed. I said, "My gosh, here's this great dessert," and now he says, "I will have to eat it all and can't share it with anyone." And so that was it. And I still, well, as I said, I remember that so vividly. And the fact that I guess Nana was such a great caterer that she knew how to handle the pie and handle the ice cream. So that here out in Pomona Fairgrounds on that hot day, everything was still in top shape. So then there's a picture of the Pomona, the barracks that we were in, and in the background is the grandstand for the horse races. Yeah, so while I was there, I never realized that grandstand was back there. I guess we're concentrating more on close in on this horizon, but that was the type of barrack that we were in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, Takashi, after you spent some months here at the Assembly Center, your family was put on a train and you didn't know where you were going, and you ended up at the Heart Mountain internment camp in Wyoming. You arrived when you were 16 years old, and 2 years later at 18, you received your draft notice. Can you tell me a little bit about receiving that draft notice and you had already been thinking about some injustices that were happening and why you decided to resist that draft? Can you tell me that story, please, Takashi?
Yeah, well, actually, that's one of the things that I, as a 16-year-old, very, I should say, ignorant of civil rights and American history, and didn't realize what was really happening to us. And I'm afraid that most of us, or most of the Japanese Americans, there's a picture of the family. I'm the one, the tall one in the back. But the thing was that as we were in the camp, the older people were talking and discussing. Says, well, we should have resisted. We should have brought a lawsuit up to so that we would fight against being put into these camps. And then as I learned more about what had happened to especially the farmers who had crops, some of them were ready to be harvested. They just lost that completely. They're unable now, later on, I find out that unable to pay the mortgage, they lost the farm. But in my case, I was a little I was very upset. So I wrote a letter to my homeroom teacher at Belmont High School, telling, that I felt that all of this was completely wrong and so forth. Well, she later wrote back and said, I was very sorry that I felt this way. But that was sort of the beginning. And so 2 years later, when I got the draft notice, well, I said, well, this is completely crazy. And so I says, at that time, had figured that I'm not going. And so that was it. And then within Heart Mountain was one of the organized resistance or trying now to work or somehow to publicize the fact that we were in these camps And so we thought, well, if we then go to the court, then we can probably bring this story out, and maybe the American public can now realize that what was happening to us. Well, at the trial, that didn't even come up. So anyway, the Fair Play Committee was really, I guess, had its start with a guy named Kiyoshi Okamoto, and he was preaching in Heart Mountain about the fact that we lost our civil rights, and also the fact that under the constitutions that you had to have a trial to really so that we lost all of this without a fair trial. And so out of that Fair Play Committee, the result was that if we get our civil rights back, that we would gladly serve, and I certainly would agree with that. But then we lost our case in court. We took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the story. And there I am in the back row. And when that picture was being taken, I suddenly thought, 50 years from now, this picture might be important. So I stuck my head out, and so to make sure that I was in that be recognizable in that picture. But the thing was, we were sentenced for 3 years. I served 2 years. And then in 1940, there we are on the release date on Bastille Day. And I think it was 1946. And again, I'm the tallest one in the picture. But by then, President Harry Truman was in office. And in 1947, in the Christmas amnesty time, he then pardoned all of the draft resistors. And so then with the pardon, I got my full citizenship back. And then about 10 years later, with my full citizenship back, I ended up, I said, when I got my second draft notice, I says, yes, says I will gladly serve. And I ended up eventually in the medics at Fort Hood, Texas. Yeah.
Thank you, Takashi. And, when you were sentenced, you ended up in federal penitentiary, correct?
I'm sorry?
When you were sentenced, you were sentenced to a federal you were sent to a federal penitentiary, correct?
Yes. And the thing was that we're standing there with the picture on the release date at a place called Steilacoom, which is a small little railroad stop a few miles south of Seattle. So then we were all sent back into the exclusion zone. So I thought that was kind of bad. But there were 63 of us in that trial, and that was so large that they divided the group. The older people went to Fort Leavenworth, and we, in the younger group here, ended up in McNeil Island Penitentiary. That penitentiary is no longer there. But so that is the day that we got out. Yeah.
Thank you, Takashi. And, I wanted to bring back Jimmy. And, you had this experience with incarceration due to the fact that you resisted being drafted while your family was forcibly interned in a concentration camp. And Jimmy, you write a lot about the disparities in policing that exist to this day and that you've experienced in your own life, and the disparities with incarceration and what that does to people of color who it affects, disproportionately. Can you say more about that, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Sorry, that was for Jimmy.
Oh, yes. And I just want to say thank you so much, Samanta, for facilitating this discussion with elders in our community. And thank you to the elders for such vivid storytelling. It's beautiful to hear of your survival, to hear of your neighborhood making, and also to hear of your intellect as you look at the world around you and realize that there are injustices taking place all around us, which are important to be conscious about. Certainly this event is for a neighborhood. The big idea being here, how do we make a neighborhood? and certainly excavating our history is very much a part of that. I wanted to note that, especially as I hear you all describing these policies, especially the process of making space for yourselves at the same time that real estate and public officials are sort of in the background redlining communities. These are things you all are not familiar with. These are things that are not publicly available data. These are things that are mostly kept filed in a cabinet somewhere, if you will. And so what ends up being the case, in my view, is a real link between internment and redlining, right? Because these are ways of distinguishing others that ultimately become very violent ways of removing others, correct? So the moment that we distinguish a person as a subversive racial element, or the moment that we distinguish a person as blight or undesirable for investment, we've actually taken a step towards dehumanizing those people. And certainly housing is involved with that, right? So you all lose housing as you are forcibly removed. And what's also true is that these are the 1940s, right? Housing, especially for African Americans, going back to the beginning of the presentation, was absolutely compromised. So I want to take us back to one of our images from the screen here. And I want to describe, I want to note this part here. Going back to housing, and especially public housing, right? This is an article dated November 28th, 1946, in which Charlotta Bass at the California Eagle essentially notes that the city of LA at some point actually had a plot to drive the Negroes back south. And so respectfully, this is what I want to note here. During World War II, the era is really hostile, not only to Japanese Americans, but also Mexican Americans, right? With the Zoot Suit riots that we saw. And as we heard earlier, Negro leaders testified at that time that they needed housing so that crime, so that sanitary conditions wouldn't deteriorate in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And yet we've got charges here that real estate interests actually plotted to, quote, drive Negroes back south, unquote. And so it's a little spotty here, but what I'm going to do instead then is I'm going to take us to the website for a moment. Let's go here. Let's go here. So here, the speaker, this is someone that the California Eagle actually interviewed, noted that 40% of federal appropriations for, quote, slum clearance, which is how they described building new neighborhoods at the time, were actually declined because apparently there were no slums in Los Angeles. But this is an interesting contrast that we have to think about here with what was noted earlier in the redlining map, which was that, oh, in areas like Virgil Village and the Sunset Junction area, we've got not a slum district, but a blighted district, right? And so there's this quote, and it's a little sensitive. It's very offensive. So I just want to note that. But this is what a public official at some point in the City Housing Commission in Los Angeles actually stated about public housing for non-white communities in the city of LA during the 1940s. So they refused to let us make a survey of the city's districts. They said there were only dirty N-words, Mexicans, Chinks, and Japs in those poor districts, and that they ought to be made to get along the best they could. When, however, a survey was finally made, it was found that those who lived in the slum districts were not only Negroes, Mexicans, and Japanese. 65% of the slum homes were occupied by white families, he declared. And so I just want to note this for you all. 65% of, quote, slum districts being occupied by white people really meant that redline neighborhoods were integrated, correct? So that is to say that they were not totally African-American or totally Japanese-American, but nestled within a larger context, they were really diverse, correct? So I just want to make these notes about neighborhoods like ours in the 1940s. I also want to make one last note regarding especially this World War II era, right? Where we've got a lot of firepower on the ground and we've got a lot of firepower in the air. And so basically the investment in not only removing others, but also taking land and warring against other factions or other states, this becomes very, very much a huge investment for the US government, correct? And so especially as I hear about internment, I think of the sort of civil rights era that's only 10 years away over the 1960s. And I think of LAPD, and I think of policing in the city of Los Angeles and the way policing became a larger investment decade after decade after decade, to the point that, again, when I think of East Hollywood now, I cannot help but think of helicopters. I cannot help but think of police sirens, and I cannot help but think of a lot of paranoia regarding who may be policed. So just one final note. Just regarding disparities between policing, just for the record here, this is data taken from the $1 Million Hoods database, actually, which shows that in neighboring Los Feliz and Silver Lake, where communities are predominantly white, there's significant investment in policing, but not abundant investment in policing. However, in East Hollywood, this neighborhood, which we're talking about, this neighborhood which so many of us are nestled in, data shows that more than 5 times that policing in the area is more than 5 times larger than what you see in whiter Los Feliz and in whiter Silver Lake. And so today, in a predominantly immigrant community, we're really sort of taxing communities twice, if you will, especially if they are predominantly renters. That means they do not own property, right? This goes back to property owning and whether a family can build wealth by homeowning over the course of time. And then policing is a sort of double taxation, because once we police people and incarcerate people, especially currently, we've only increased their chances of homelessness in the current context, in the 21st century, in 2020 and 2021, if you will. And so this is the current environment that we see. But I want to note this because in areas like East Hollywood, in areas like other redlined portions of Los Angeles, these communities are, like you all, resilient, forming bonds, making friends, establishing lifelong relationships, even in a hostile environment, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. And, you know, just with that note around redlining and policing, I do want to ask Karen and Takashi, did you know that your neighborhood had been redlined?
I didn't. I was not aware, in fact, until I started working with you, Samantha. There was a story, well, this is my story, but my parents at one point, and it would have to have been in the, I think in the 60s, 70s, wanted to put on an addition to our house. There were 5 of us in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, and they wanted to make improvements on it. They had plans drawn up, and I remember I must have been somewhere in my early teens. I was attracted to the plans, the rolled up architectural drawings. And then all of a sudden, the plans were put away and were put in the closet. And Cheryl and I talked about this recently. And what we figured was that here were 2 people who were solidly middle class. My mom was an educator. My dad was a postal supervisor. They must not have been able to get financing for the improvements on the property. And why would that be? And the only thing we could come up with was that it feels like it had something to do with the redlining, the way the area was viewed from externally. And, you know, it makes me very angry. It makes me very angry and hurt for my parents who worked incredibly hard through their lives. But, you know, so that I do remember. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Takashi, did you have any idea that your neighborhood was redlined at some point?
No, not at all. But as later on, as I began to look back, that I realized that, oh, you know, well, here's thinking back in those days, I think of Melrose, Beverly Boulevard, and Hoover, and Vermont. And because I remember at Dayton Heights, we had all white students, but then most of them were coming in from north of Melrose or east of Hoover. And then I didn't think much about that at all at that time. But now I think, yeah, I can see that there was something there. And today I always refer to the place that I grew up in, the ghetto. So it's something that I guess I did remember hearing people talk about the fact that it was difficult to, well, it was almost impossible to buy a house outside of the area. But there were a few Japanese families that owned, or I don't know whether they owned it or whether they rented, but they were like living on the Mitchell Terreno was one where they had a couple of families there. And then there are others living more into the Hollywood, I guess what we call West Hollywood area today. So, but no, it was just more recently that I suddenly realized, hey, you know, what was really going on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And then, you know, Takashi, you're on the board of the Heart Mountain Foundation, and you spent a lot of years telling your story of what happened to your family and what happened to other Japanese and Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Why do you think it's important to tell this story, and what connections do you see with what's happening today at the border?
As to where?
Oh, what connections do you see between what happened to the Japanese Americans and what's going on today at the border?
Oh, yeah. Well, in fact, we have one of our board members who's been actually going down into those areas and getting, you know, information. And so his particular talk that he gives, he's a nationally known speaker now, and Sam Mihara has brought this point out, that what is happening today at the border, and especially and the separation of the families and so on, that again, we're seeing the same type of thing that has happened to us, not only us, but in the early 30s, I understand, and in fact, I have an article out of the LA Times where they gathered up the Mexican families and took them to the border and told them, don't come back. And the children were US citizens. And so the actual number is still not known. People are, I guess historians are sort of guessing that it could have been anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million Mexicans that were affected in the early 30s. So, well, what's been happening along is I would say it's nothing new, but then what we need to do is expose these and tell the people what has been happening. And so that, again, we see what's happening at the border today. Says, oh, wait a minute, folks, you're doing the same darn thing that has been going on for years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're muted, Sammy.
Whoops. Did you want to add something, Jimmy? Or?
Yeah, well, I do want to note that we've got some great questions that actually attendees have asked. and there are all sorts. So we're going to try and get through a few of them. And I do think we'll be able to continue in our discussion and get a few final points across while also answering our attendees' questions. And so the one that I saw that just came to mind for myself was a really interesting question posed by one attendee asking what you all, especially Karen and Takashi, make of what is known as gentrification today and the displacement of working class Black and immigrant communities from the city of Los Angeles and also in East Hollywood. What have you seen and what are your thoughts on this issue generally?
Well, I moved back to J Flats in 1990 when my grandmother passed away, and I moved into her house. So between 1990 and 2017, I saw the neighborhood changing. It had been primarily Latino after this long period of being primarily Japanese. But then in the last several years, there were a lot of young white people moving in, which is fine. And they brought a different flavor to the neighborhood. It's, it's so interesting that when you don't know what's happening with these external forces, you welcome people as they come in and they bring their flavor and you add your flavor, and that's, as you were saying, Jimmy, that that becomes the neighborhood. That becomes a neighborhood with people sharing and learning and growing from each other. But as I look at the external forces, one of the things that happened to me was that my mother, uncle, and aunt at some point decided that they wanted to sell the property that my grandmother's house was on, grandparents, I'm sorry, was on. And I wasn't in a financial position to buy it. The same thing happened with my mother's, my mother and father's house, the original property, 537. I wasn't in a position to buy it. I would have loved to. And they weren't in a position, frankly, to pass it down. So you get caught in, the repercussions of these external forces. And maybe you realize it, maybe you don't. But at some point, I just was not able to financially stay in the neighborhood. Rents would go up and up and up, I couldn't sustain it. So I know this is happening with a lot of the families that, especially a lot of the Latino families that are in the neighborhood, with children to raise and everybody has to work. And, you get to a point where if you're not buying the house and investing in yourself, you're paying that out to somebody every month. And you do the best you can, but this is painful stuff. This is really painful stuff. And that's why I'm working on this book about my family's story, because these stories must be told if this country is to live up to its constitution, those principles. We've got to hear these stories and we've got to make some of the stuff right. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. How about yourself, Mr. Hoshizaki? What do you make of this term gentrification? Are you familiar with this term, and are you familiar with how this is functioning in the city of Los Angeles and in cities all over the US and really all over the world, where working class people are increasingly being displaced and also dispossessed of space to make room for wealthier, disposable income and so on? Or is this just unrelated to your work currently?
Well, the thing is, being in the neighborhood, I see these things going on, and well, I don't know whether it's unfortunate or fortunate, but again, we have a thing called inflation, and also not only in terms of the monetary inflation, but then we also have the increase of the population, which then puts a real pressure on the real estate. And it's, to me, as I look around, and especially from when I drive into the Civic Center in Los Angeles, going along Temple or Beverly Boulevard, I'm astounded or even horrified to see some of the apartment buildings, or the apartments, or the condo buildings that are going up. And from a financial standpoint, yeah, whoever is there who are operating these things, they are in turn pushing and risking their investments, but in turn, the requirement for the increasing population, and also, I guess, I don't know, I don't have the figures, and I don't know if we are having an influx of people coming into the area. So it puts a real pressure on real estate. And the most horrifying thing that I've seen, and I mentioned to some of my friends, is what has gone up on Sunset and the Hillhurst area. It just used to be what is it, an auto dealer area, but now you look up and see that building, and the number of apartments. I have no idea the number of apartments going in, and yet I guess the numbers and the research has shown that those apartments will probably be easily occupied and it's wanted. So in turn, that puts the pressure on those of us who are in the area. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. And so, well, perhaps we might, with this discussions that we are having, we might come up with something that may help as amiable solution to what we see today.
I did see another great question, moving away from these slightly heavier subjects for a moment, asking if you all, as lifelong residents, recall seeing the development of East Hollywood into a really multi-ethnic neighborhood that also includes Filipino and Thai and Armenian residents. Do you all recall in your time throughout the neighborhood when this was first developing and how? We'd be very interested in hearing about this. Takashi, maybe you can go ahead, and then Karen.
Well, the thing I remember, this is all during the era after we came back, and to see as time went on, we would have Southeast Asian people coming in. We have so there's this evolution of the different ethnic groups moving in, and I guess one family moves in, and then others of that particular group find that, yeah, this is kind of a nice little neighborhood, and so we would then have an increase in the number of certain ethnic groups, and then suddenly there'll be a little change. And so I can't really remember all the changes that went on, but I do remember that, yeah, along Madison Avenue for a while, there was a lot of the families living in these smaller homes before those big apartments went up were Southeast Asians. And then that suddenly shifted. So I did see, yes, a changing of the different ethnic groups. And then I guess now we had the Latinos move in. And then as Karen pointed out, that I suddenly see someone do term a white person walking through the neighborhood, and and I guess I sort of respond like a white person would respond to a black person walking through the neighborhood. Says, "What's that person doing in this neighborhood?" And suddenly realizing, there's this change that's been going on, and sometimes it says, "Yeah, it's for the better," but in turn, the whole, I think one of the things that we're faced with is this horrendous need or the requirement for housing, in which in turn now affects the financial standings. And I'm sort of shocked that when I see pieces of property that sold for $600 for a 50 by 150 foot lot back in the 30s, now you can, with whatever standing on it, doesn't matter, will sell close to or over $1 million. And that is, to me, is just mind-boggling. And so what do we do to compensate, or what can we do sort of to alleviate this type of situation?
Yes, thank you, Takashi. Karen, how about yourself? Do you recall watching the neighborhood grow into this larger area for so many different residents as it is today?
Well, I have to say I was remiss when I was running down the names of our Japanese friends that also in the area at that time were Caucasian families and Black families, and I've got to give a real shout out to the Johals, who were an Indian family. I think there were 5 kids. We all, all growing up together. There were also at Dayton Heights, we had people from the Pacific Islands. And then certainly, Takashi mentioned Virgil, but also then when we got to Belmont, my Belmont High School, I think was different than certainly my mother's or Takashi and Rufus and Aunt Babs's Belmont, where there were, I don't want to say a little bit of everything, but there really was a little bit of everything. It was a marvelous environment to reach adulthood in. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that this diversity has always been the nature of this area, and certainly expanding area of Los Angeles. And it was all for the better for all of us. A lot of, unfortunately, as I see it, a lot of us are on Facebook, and we go back 50 years together, and there are all kinds of people. So it's wonderful. I don't think there was any one period when this change happened, but I think the change for me, as I look at it now, is very much what Takashi was saying, with the increase in I don't know if they're condominiums or apartments, but they are not in the affordable range for most. So I'll just say it that way.
Yeah.
Sammy, did you have a question? I was going to pick another one from the Q&A box that we saw.
No, let's keep going.
Yes, one attendee asked if there's a particular space in East Hollywood, whether it was a business or a place to hang out, a recreational area that you, Karen, and Takashi would love for others to know about.
Oh, that's a good question.
Any
No,
businesses, any other spaces?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Because I wasn't too much of a neighborhood person. I mean, yeah, but you're talking about a possibility of recreational or other things.
Or favorite spaces to hang out, or maybe maybe a shop where you always got your milk and so on, the little things that make a neighborhood.
Well, we had the Endo Brothers garage, and but that was the only place I remember but it was mostly the Niseis that hung around there. And what was happening in one particular period of time when the freeway traffic was building up, and so most of them were gardeners, and so instead of and they lived on the other side of the town, like Monterey and so on, San Gabriel area.
Mm.
So instead of fighting that traffic, uh, the guys would come in and stop and gather at Endo Brothers. So that was the only thing that I remember of a gathering of it, and I don't remember any other group uh, uh, of gathering like that or anywhere else. But I was not much in terms of a church attendance, but I think that the church itself, the Christ Presbyterian Church, would probably be a gathering places that people had. Maybe Karen could maybe comment on that if she remembers anything, or maybe from what her mother was sort of active in that group.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just before then, what were the intersections for the Endo Brothers? Do you recall, Takashi? Where could people find that previously?
You mean the which? Now, what was that again?
The intersections or the street that the Endo Brothers shop was located at?
Oh yeah, on the Virgil and Clinton, across the street from the grocery store that my dad ran. Yeah.
It's called John's now, but back in the day it was called, as Takashi said, the Endo Brothers. And funny story, my dad, when he worked at night from when I was little, but when we were older, he would come home from work at a kind of a normal person's time, 5 or 6 o'clock, and he would, I don't know if he would park the car up there or drive home and walk back, but Daddy would go have a beer with the guys at Endo Brothers, and that was the times that I saw him. It was a good-looking group of guys, hanging out. But yeah, as Takashi said, the Christ Presbyterian Church, which is on Madison and Clinton, on what is that, the northwest corner, has been there. Oh boy, I don't know if Bruce Yumura is watching, but he would know very much the history of Christ Press, but that's been there, I'm going to guess, since the 1920s. And, for us growing up, that was, I wouldn't say a hangout, but there were always kind of activities that we would get involved in. We did a lot of, and now as I say we, I'm talking about my brother and sister and I did a lot of things at Belmont High School. That was probably the hangout place. Yeah.
Wow. I have to tell you.
How do you say that, Jimmy?
I have to tell you that I went to John Marshall High School.
Oh.
And you probably know that these schools are not on the best terms.
Not on the best terms. Yeah.
To hear you say that you, as a resident of East Hollywood, were actually going out to Belmont to hang out with kids at Belmont, that was a no-no. Also, as you say, activities we'd get involved in. I think about my friends and I growing up in the neighborhood. and we were a bunch of boys. Activities we were involved in are not activities we could probably note now in this panel. But there's another really great question that I saw from one attendee that asked if either of you were around during the construction of the 101 freeway. I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm curious if either of you were sort of witness to the building of the massive 101 freeway that eventually cut through the neighborhood.
Well, one of the things that I remember, that this was now more in after the war, we had no idea exactly where it was going to go, but then finally they laid out the area, and it was really something to see, because I remember who was that? I think it was old Shig Kishiyama and I think that was Shig, were sort of wandering around, and then it was a time where the work had stopped, I guess, and I remember seeing this big huge Caterpillar tractor there, and so we got a chance to take a little better look at it. But then I remember in that total construction, so what was going on, and then the other thing that was really not that in that 101 freeway going through, it just devastated the whole area, because the junior high school or the middle school, Rufus and I then used to walk across Beverly Boulevard. Well, now that freeway is is completely cut off, or the little walkway that Rufus and I used to take to go to Virgil. So it was quite a thing that really cut up the neighborhood. But again, sometime after that, there are now talk of another freeway, and I don't know quite what was going on, but there's a huge area that, as the Hollywood Freeway crosses Vermont Avenue, and you sometimes wonder why such a large area, but that was supposedly, my understanding, of a junction now of another freeway coming directly from the east, and then to continue on to the west towards Santa Monica. But then, but it didn't quite match the story that we ran into, because for a while, this freeway that was proposed to go east-west was actually then to run just south of Melrose, which then again would just cut up the neighborhood. And in fact, the people who lived in the area, the state came in and actually bought the property. And so many of the people who were there for years now had to move out, because now this freeway is going to come through. And by that time, our family was running the nursery, which was just going to be completely run over. So the area between Clinton and Melrose was going to be completely taken over by this proposed freeway. But fortunate for us, what happened was that freeway was also to cut through Beverly Hills.
Right, the Beverly Hills freeway.
Yeah,
which was eventually canceled.
Yeah, I wonder why.
Well,
I love that from you, Karen.
The reason I heard was that the lawyers in Beverly Hills says, well, he said, you guys go ahead and try it. He said, you're going to have lawsuits and we're going to litigate until doomsday. And so the state of California gave up. And so and then also it was going to cut through Silver Lake and I think Echo Park. It was right. a really a brutal one, but that's not that's no longer there. So anyway, the freeway as it stood, as some of the planners not thinking of what was happening to the people in the neighborhood that if so that particular Beverly Hills freeway went through, it would just completely devastate where we are now. Wouldn't leave anything at all. Yeah, I'd leave with that. Yeah.
How about, thank you so much, Takashi. How about yourself, Karen? Do you recall these days? The 101 freeway, I believe, I saw pictures during the photo essay that I looked through the LAPL archives for. I saw pictures of the 101 freeway at the Silver Lake entrance and exit opening in 1951. So might you or any of your family members have any recollections? Did anyone ever talk about this thing called the freeway? I can't even imagine how new that must have been during that time or growing up in this era.
The only thing you have to remember, I was born in 52, so it was there when I got ready to drive it, and that's where my head was at. But I do remember my mother talking about not the 101, but the Pasadena freeway when they first built that connection going out to Pasadena, that she and her younger brother Rufus took my grandfather's car and drove out, and I think they were going maybe 40 miles an hour and felt that they were flying. But yeah, I don't remember them talking very much about, the days before the freeway what was there, but yeah, sorry.
What that Pasadena freeway was the first one to go in, and so the connection was
1949.
Was something that that people really wanted, especially those commuting, and so in my mind, I remember as well. Now they have plans to make and build these types of freeways so that moving around, commuting, and would be much easier. And so the fact that I guess the Southern California Auto Club would then sort of publicize or talk about now in order to make it easier to go out to the San Fernando Valley instead of taking an hour and a half. Well, you'd be able to do it in 20 minutes. And so it was sort of a boon to those who we were an automotive community anyway. And so that many people were looking forward to it, except those who the freeway is going to run over in order now to make this possible. Yeah. So.
Very good. So there was another question specifically from a JPL, a fellow JPL employee that asked what it was like going to JPL at some point, Takashi.
Going to which now?
Working at JPL?
Yes. And so so when I was working at JPL, it was it kind of nice because I being in the Virgil district or East Hollywood, I was going counter traffic, and so going to work, the freeway was virtually empty. Where on the other side, the people were commuting from, say, La Cañada and Pasadena and so forth into the Civic Center, and that side will be completely jammed. And I remember sometimes they had an accident down there and at the exit. I forgot exactly where it was down below there, and that traffic jam would go wind back about 2-3 miles. So it was, but then the fact that that freeway was there made it very nice in commuting, at least from my standpoint. I was going on the opposite direction. Yeah.
I think that's really great that you say that, to tell you the truth, Takashi, because as a resident in the neighborhood, after high school, I actually went out to Pasadena for community college for a number of years. So I was also going from this central side of LA, and I wasn't driving. So I'd take the red line to the gold line, which you all are probably familiar with. And it was similar, right? Instead of people from Pasadena coming into the central area to work, I was going from the central area over to Pasadena. And it was really interesting seeing these two different neighborhoods. That's certainly a part of what got me to think about different neighborhoods, different parts of LA, and why they were shaped the way they were shaped. We also have another interesting question about, and this is a heavier question, but the question of reparations, actually. So we spoke about internment, and we spoke about Japanese Americans at some point being interned. What can you tell us about reparations, for one? And then there was a second part to the attendees' question, which was that how the Japanese American community may feel about African Americans at some point receiving reparations. Now, I know these are heavy questions, but as you are allowed, or as you're able to, we'd be happy just to get a little bit of your insights.
Yeah, well, we had actually, there were 2 times that we could get some money back, and very early on, when we came back, we were able to then list the various pieces of property, and I was also helping out in that Hollywood Japanese Institute. They were running it as a language school then, and they had lost quite a bit of equipment, and also they had a bus, and that was gone. And so the board then put in a request, and I forgot what the amount was and so forth. But when we finally got that particular reparation, it was something like only on about maybe 10 cents on the dollar. And we thought about it for a while and says, well, should we even accept that and try to get some more? And the board member decided, no, it's not worth it. We'll take whatever they gave. And I think it was only several $100s that the board got to help in there. But then in the second round, yes, there was a push, and finally we did end up, and that was really after they discovered that the U.S., the lawyers, especially as they were trying to decide, to, I would use the term, to kick us out of California, that they had not presented the full bit of information. And so, in fact, it was turned out that the government lawyers, and now use the term, actually lied at the Supreme Court hearing. And so when that was exposed, then that opened up the gate, so that finally then we and plus hearings that were held throughout the United States, that we were then able to get those who were still living and that went through the camps, we got $20,000. But then when one says, yeah, that's $20,000, but then when one stops to think, well, what were the real losses? I think it should have been something like 10 times plus of the actual losses that were incurred. Now today, the JACL, the Japanese American Civil Citizens League, and also other Japanese organizations are getting behind the push for to actually help the Black communities to push to get a reparation, some sort of reparation, because one thing among the Japanese is that an actual apologies, just a word of apologies and bowing and so forth would be enough. But in the American society, it's always cash. You got to have that money. And so the only time that it have any real meaning in making any sort of a reparation is that the cash has to change hands. And I think that, again, now we're pushing to do something that may be appropriate as that, but for the Black community, the situation is different, but then still yet we'd like to see some sort of reparation made for the Black community. Yeah.
Really great to hear you say. Karen, do you have any thoughts about reparations or some type of acknowledgement from cities like Los Angeles or LA city officials, the federal government, given, say, practices of redlining, practices of exclusion? What do you make of these now?
You know, all of the above and then some. I don't know how you could put a monetary value on what African Americans have gone through in this country and continue to go through. When I'm being my goofy self, I say, send me the check, you know. But there's a lot of work that has to be done to really study the issue, and we haven't even started that yet. That has to happen. You know, monetary, yes, that should happen. As you were saying, Takashi, you know, send me the money. But there are other things. There is and I don't know how much time we have left, but there is, and I think it's in Atlanta. Cheryl, God, where did you go? Where there's a new museum where they have gone throughout the South and documented all the places where a lynching happened. And there are stone pillars in various configurations representing sections of land and the number of lynchings that happened in each. I'm doing a terrible job at describing it, but you know, we have to study this. We have to look at it, and it's a lot of it will be connected to slavery, but a lot of it will be connected with the post-slavery years as well. So,
well, I'd like to make one short comment. With the reparation that the Japanese Americans have received, there is a fund that was set aside, and I don't really remember the actual amount, but that fund was then set aside so that the story and the history of what happened to us would then be told. And Karen just mentioned about the museum, and perhaps that might be a possible that one of the items coming out of the talk of reparation would be a sort of a ongoing fund that the various groups can then use the fund to tell the story, to make sure that what had happened or what is happening is then becomes well known, so that we understand the suffering that each different groups have also gone through. So that's just a thought that I had as another possibility, you know.
Right, and I think that does touch on another question another attendee had, which was if there are any sort of words of wisdom that you all might share with current generations in East Hollywood, organizing against injustices such as displacement, such as dispossession. How is it that perhaps these groups can learn from previous modes of organizing? This attendee also noted, it seems that Takashi, you in particular, were active against the draft movement and the federal government's call for drafting. So what may be some words of wisdom for the current generation in terms of organizing and making neighborhoods, while also essentially looking to create a more inclusive and also more historicized community in places like East Hollywood?
Well, I think again, to perhaps what is happening today, the group that is going on today you people are now actually, I think, laying so that the foundation for you now have the information, the historical facts, and then from there possibly go ahead and keep expanding as we go along. So it's just, again, an organization that will actually then be able to tell the people as to what has happened and also what possible actions that one may take. And I think this will be good. Yeah. And I think what we're doing today is a real starter.
Yeah, I think what you guys are doing is tremendous. It's magnificent, and it's been such an honor to contribute to it. You know, I would just say I had started to lose hope, especially around the murder of George Floyd. But when I saw, and there was a lot of young people come out and had their mask on, God bless them, but came out and said, you know, enough. I started to gain hope again. So just keep pushing, keep learning, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open. I was working on a piece for my niece Melissa, and we were telling a story from my mother, her grandmother's point of view, and I was saying in words that she would use, you know, look for the helpers, look for the people who will have your back, who will support you, and just keep pushing, because one day you're going to be where Takashi and I are sitting now, and you're going to wonder where did all that time go. But you guys are doing a fantastic job, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Samanta. I think with that said, we've gathered so much information, so many different stories and tidbits from our two panelists today. Samanta, I want to thank you so much for facilitating an amazing discussion, and I loved seeing those archival images as our panelists spoke just as well. I think we should talk about our next event for attendees so that we can wrap up and remind folks that we are continuing this series next week on Thursday at 6 p.m. once again. So do you want to say a little bit about next week?
Sure, yeah. So this panel series is a 3-part panel series looking at the past, present, and future of East Hollywood. So today we talked a little bit about histories of exclusion like redlining, and we heard from lifelong residents about what it was like to grow up here. Next week, we're looking at the present, and we're looking at gentrification. So we're really gonna dive deep into that. I'm going to be talking about my project, The Side of Hoover, and what it's like as a journalist to document displacement and gentrification in the neighborhood. We're going to have the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project talk about their data visualization around evictions, and we're going to have someone from the Tenants Union talk about all things tenants' rights. And then that's next week on the 11th at 6 p.m. And our last panel is on the 18th at 6 p.m. and it's all about housing, which is the future. And we're going to have Rod from Abundant Housing, Chancey Moore-Terrell from the Thai CDC, and Caroline from the Little Tokyo Service Center. So we're going to do all things housing on the 18th. So in order to RSVP, there are still some slots. You can go to easthhollywood.eventbrite. So it's event, bright, not like as in a bright light, but BRITE.com. So easthollywood.eventbrite.com. And you can follow
if you made it to this event, you're probably going to make it to the next, especially if you hung on over the 2 hours. Thank you to our attendees for asking such great questions, for making such great comments. It was really a pleasure looking through all these notes. We tried to get through all of them and almost did that, but we do want to respect our panelists and make sure that they have their rest just as well. They've given us so many stories, and I hope that this is the first of many more times that we'll get to talk about the past, present, and future of our neighborhood. So cheers. I think we're going to conclude with that. Correct, Samanta?
Yes, and I do want to just really thank our two panelists. It's an honor, a true honor to have you both here to share these stories and to allow us to deepen our relationship to the neighborhood and to the city and to really learn from you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you to the
You're
East Hollywood
welcome.
Neighborhood Council for holding this space just as well. We'll see you all next week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.